Hi, today we have Unit 5 of Mechanics Instruction That Sticks, Semicolons and Colons. Starting off with the semicolon. This cutie patootie piece of punctuation. Let me get my little laser pointer. Zoom. Right there. Semicolon has a little comma mark with a little dot on top. It's stronger than a comma, but weaker than a period. The most common place you will see them used is when you're trying to make a compound sentence with two independent clauses. A semicolon is one of your options to hold independent clause, semicolon, independent clause. It shows they're closely related, but they're also pretty independent. It also is used when you have a list and those items in the list already have commas in them, so it becomes like the super comma doing the job of a comma when you already have extra commas in your sentence. I'll show you some examples of that because it's easier to see than to explain. So a semicolon is like a super comma. It can do the job a comma by itself just can't quite handle. So when do you use a semicolon? One, you use it with an independent clause and an independent clause. And you're holding those two independent clauses together, showing that they're closely related. But this little extra dot shows that they are also pretty independent. For example, students with jobs lose focus on their schoolwork, semicolon, because that's an independent clause. Their grades begin to slip and their futures dim. Also an independent clause, but so closely related that we want to use a semicolon instead of a period. There are other options to make these two independent clauses next to each other work. For example, you can also use a semicolon with a transition word. Those transition words are known as conjunctive adverbs because they act like a conjunction, and they're telling us a little bit more about how these two independent clauses fit together. So independent clause, semicolon, transition word, comma, second independent clause. So students with jobs lose focus on their schoolwork, semicolon, hence, comma, their grades begin to slip and their futures dim. This one tells me how these two independent clauses are so closely related. You can also put conjunctive adverbs. Sometimes they can go in the middle of a sentence. If they're in the middle of a sentence, they still need commas, but they do not get a semicolon automatically. So if I said students, however, with jobs, I was going to finish that sentence differently. I would say students, comma, however, comma. So this semicolon is because of the independent clauses. They are inextricably linked. And just in case you were wondering, this slide is a list of some of the most common conjunctive adverbs, also known as transition words, that can go. So you can put a semicolon in front of it, and then a comma, and then a second independent clause, and you can make that work. You can also put a period in front of it and start a new sentence with your transition word. It doesn't have to be a semicolon situation, but it can be. So this is a nice list to know where it is. You might want to copy and paste that into your notes somewhere, or you might want to just remember where it is so you can look it up later. The other time you use a semicolon is when you've got a whole bunch of extra punctuation in that sentence already, and you need to differentiate between the commas that are associated with the things in the list and the fact that you're moving on to your next item on your list. So you have an item, comma, item. Then I have a thing, comma, thing. Then a semicolon. And then I have another other thing. So I have my semicolons separating. So it looks like this. My cousin has lived in Detroit, comma, Michigan, semicolon, Cleveland, comma, Ohio, semicolon, and Las Vegas, comma, Nevada. If you just had commas there, it would get confusing. Bobby hired Joe the carpenter, Joe, comma, the carpenter, semicolon, Larry, comma, the mason, semicolon, and Steve, comma, the electrician. So we have three people being hired, and making sure if we had just commas there, it would sound like he hired Joe, the carpenter, Larry, the mason, Steve, and the electrician. They would sound like different people. So having those semicolons clarifies that for us. Here's another example. On this plan, this comma is because this is an opener. I can eat whole grain breads, comma, pastas, comma, and tortilla chips. That's my first item on my list. Citrus fruits, whoops, missed a comma there. Green vegetables, comma, and some roughage, semicolon, and lean meats, comma, such as turkey or fish. So the items are separated by type with the semicolons, and the items inside the list items have commas. So using the semicolons helps make it easier for your reader to understand. Another thing that might make it easier for your reader to understand is to just revise the sentence. If you don't like having all that punctuation in a sentence and it makes you feel uneasy to have so many pieces of punctuation, even though it's correct and you know it's correct, you certainly, as a writer, can revise your sentence so that that much punctuation is not necessary. Or if you're a super big comma fan and you like having sentences that are grammatically correct and use a lot of punctuation, you certainly can develop that skill too. So now colons. So that's it for semicolons. With 3 good reasons. You're separating independent clauses, and you're using a transition word, or you have a list that is already filled with commas, so you need a step up from regular comma to the super comma or semicolon. What is a colon? Colon is the 2 dots on top of each other, and it's kind of like not really a super period, but it does have that end of a sentence function too. So it's almost like a period. So a colon indicates a stop and then introduces something. The colon is kind of like a drum roll, announcing something's coming. So the part of the sentence that comes before the colon is an independent clause. And then you have the rest. It's either an explanation or maybe it's a list. We'll look at some examples. So you can have an independent clause and then a list of stuff, separated by commas. Our guide told us to bring the following items. Now, it doesn't sound complete because I don't know what the items are, but it is a complete sentence grammatically. Now, logically, you might want to adjust it. So this is an independent clause, can stand by itself grammatically. I'm curious as to what those items are, so I'm going to add this colon, which functions as this is the end of the independent clause period, and then I have a list coming. So our guide told us to bring the following items: colon, a lantern, a sleeping bag, and a tent. Notice we can get rid of that colon option by changing the sentence. Our guide told us to bring a lantern, a sleeping bag, and a tent. We can make a shorter sentence and avoid the use of the colon if we want to. You can use a colon after stop to introduce a quotation mark. This is not, it's similar to when you have a comma and a he said, she said situation, but it's a little different in the tone. So the president's attitude was cold and detached. Colon, we must not let emotion interfere with our mission. Not the more common way to do it, obviously. We don't see this very often, but it's sometimes useful to be able to do. So you could say the president was cold and president said in a cold and detached manner, comma, we must not let our emotion interfere also. So options. We always have options when it comes to how we want to present our information through writing. Sometimes you'll see a colon used after a stop, after an independent clause, to introduce an explanation or a summary of what the first part is. So independent clause, and then sometimes that answer is also an independent clause, like this example. So it's obvious why you're tired, colon, The answer to the question, you are staying up too late. So it is, in this case, the answer to a question or statement. Again, colons are not a super common piece of punctuation that is used in writing, but they're handy to know so that you can shake things up now and then and add a little style, a little variety to your writing. So your practice assessment options are as usual. First, practice a couple of times with some practice worksheets, and then demonstrate your mastery through one of these options, or come up with an option of your own. Thank you.